They say heartbreak makes the best stories, but she never asked if I wanted mine told. I found her manuscript by accident. It sat on her desk, printed neatly, with my name crossed out and hers signed at the bottom in bold. The title, He Never Saw It Coming. I read it in silence, word for word, paragraph by paragraph, every shattered memory of our relationship retold through her lens, twisted, sharpened, sold. She turned my breakdown into a plot twist, my therapy sessions into punchlines, my vulnerability into her rising action. She had smiled at me that night, held my hand like nothing was wrong, but behind her eyes. She already knew she'd submitted our story to the contest. She just didn't expect I'd enter too, and she never expected the judges to recognize the raw pain in my version, because hers was polished, mine was bleeding. So when the host opened the envelope and read my name, not hers, her expression cracked like a dropped mirror. She weaponized my heartbreak, but I turned it into a legacy, and this is the real story she was too scared to write. She always carried that leather-bound notebook, the spine cracked, the edges worn like it had been thumbed through 1,000 lifetimes. Even on our first date, when the rain came slanting down through the broken roof of that train station cafe, her hand kept drifting toward it like it had a pulse of its own. "I write so I don't forget the way people make me feel," she said, brushing a strand of damp hair from her cheek. Her eyes flicked to mine, then to the ink-stained page. "And you already feel like a scene I don't want to lose." I smiled, stupidly. My heart skipped like a boy's, not a man's. But even then, I noticed her fingers curled tighter around the pen than they did around mine. I told myself she was just passionate, that writers see the world differently, but deep down, something in me shivered when she smiled after I confessed something that hurt. Maybe I should have known, but when you're starved of being seen, even a spotlight that burns feels like love. She was the first person I told about my brother. The accident, the guilt I wore like a second skin, the way I still flinch when someone says, "Drive safe." We sat in my apartment, rain streaking the windows. I remember how she curled her legs up under her, notebook in hand. She didn't interrupt, didn't gasp or pity me, she just listened, pen tapping softly, then moving, like my grief was music, like she needed to score it perfectly. Afterward, she kissed my forehead, said, "Thank you for trusting me," and I felt warm for the first time in a long while. I didn't notice she hadn't looked me in the eye once since I started talking. Some nights, I woke up from dreams where I was screaming and no sound came out. She'd be sitting on the floor across from the bed, notebook propped against her knee, scribbling furiously in the dark. The lamplight turned her into a silhouette, one that studied me instead of holding me. When I asked what she was writing, she'd smile and say, "Just trying to make sense of the silence." I mistook that for compassion. I told myself she was documenting the storm so she could walk through it with me, but I was the storm, and she was drawing escape routes. There was a night I remember too vividly. I was holding her hand, shaking, tears streaming down my face after a panic attack hit out of nowhere. I felt like I was unraveling, every breath too loud, every second too long. She whispered, "Don't move," then slipped her hand away and opened her notebook. She watched me, eyes wide, almost in awe, and began to write. Her pen moved like it had been waiting for this. I stared at her through the blur, and for the first time, I didn't feel held, I felt used. I didn't say anything, didn't want to accuse her, didn't want to believe it. But that moment hung between us like the scent of something burning. It wasn't always like that. There were soft moments, Sunday mornings wrapped in sunlight and her laugh, hot chocolate on her sleeve, my head on her lap as she read her favorite lines out loud, little notes left in my coat pocket, "You're more than what you survived." But now I wonder, did she write those for me, or were they lines she was testing, polishing for something else? I asked her once, half joking, "What if I'm just your muse?" She looked up and said, "Don't be silly, you're the reason I can write at all." Now I realize, that wasn't a denial, it was an admission. I started avoiding mirrors. Not because I hated what I saw, but because I didn't know who she saw when she looked at me. Was I her partner, or a character she was crafting? She once told me, "You have the kind of sadness that stays in a reader's bones." And I thought it was beautiful. Now it feels like a dissection. The last time I saw her truly smile was when she received an email notification. Her hand flew to her mouth, and she let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. "I think I finally wrote something real," she whispered. And I nodded, proud. Because I thought that's what love was, cheering for someone, even when you're not part of the plot. But later that night, when she was asleep, her phone lit up again. The draft was still open on her laptop, and I read it, line by line, scene by scene. And it was me. Every scar, every sob, even the night I collapsed on the floor, begging for a breath I couldn't find. It was all there. Reworded, beautiful, polished. And hers. I closed the laptop, went to the window, and watched the rain drip down the glass like ink running off a page. I didn't confront her, didn't throw things or shout, because what do you do when someone steals your pain and turns it into art? What do you say when your heartbreak becomes someone else's masterpiece? You don't scream, you write your own ending, and that's exactly what I started doing that night. There's a silence that only happens after a rejection email, the kind that doesn't shout, just settles heavy in your chest like dust that won't lift. That night, I came home late, soaked in failure, my tie is undone, my hands still tremble from pretending to be someone confident in a boardroom I never belonged in. She was curled up on the couch, mug of tea untouched, legs folded beneath her, notebook already open, eyes waiting. I didn't even get past the sink, dropped the envelope on the counter like it burned, and slid to the kitchen floor. The tiles were cold, but not as cold as the thought, I'll never be enough. My voice cracked when I said it aloud, and just as the first sob crawled up my throat, she stood, but not to hold me, not to kneel beside me, she reached for her pen. "I just need to get this out before I forget the wording," she whispered, already scribbling, and I nodded, because love, I thought, meant letting your partner create, even when your heart was unraveling in front of them. I thought it was her way of processing, that maybe she needed to record pain in order to soften it. But the way her eyes lit up when I broke down, it wasn't tenderness, it was discovery. She watched my grief like a painter watches sunset bleed into the ocean, hungry to capture it before it faded. I didn't see it then, didn't realize I was the scene she was waiting for, that my rawness wasn't sacred to her, it was source material. There was a night in November. The wind had howled through the apartment windows like it was mourning something. I couldn't sleep, the panic came fast, sharp, like hands around my throat. I sat upright in bed, chest heaving, arms shaking. She stirred beside me. I thought, just for a moment, that she'd hold me, that she'd whisper, "It's okay, you're safe." Instead, she reached for the lamp, soft light spilled over her face, casting half of it in gold, the other in shadow. She grabbed the notebook. And then, like it was the most natural thing in the world, she said, "Don't move, this would make a beautiful breakdown scene." I stopped breathing. Not because the panic was choking me, but because her words were. I looked at her, really looked, her pupils wide with excitement, lips slightly parted, as if witnessing a performance she'd waited weeks for. She wasn't seeing me, she was seeing the moment. And I froze, not from fear, not even from heartbreak, but from the realization that I had mistaken being studied for being loved. Later that night, when I could finally breathe again, I found her notes on the kitchen table. She hadn't tried to hide them, she never did, maybe because she didn't see anything wrong with it, or maybe she just never thought I'd look. It was all there, bullet points, descriptions, dialogue pulled straight from my unraveling. He folds in on himself like paper wet with guilt. Chest heaves, one breath, two breaths, pause. The silence after is more painful than the scream. Add metaphor, storm in his throat. I touched the ink with trembling fingers, still wet, still fresh, still mine. I left the pages where I found them, didn't confront her, didn't tear them up or burn them. What would that change? She had already written me, already stolen the parts of me I wasn't ready to share. I went back to bed, but not to sleep. I lay next to her, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her breath. So steady, so calm, while I fell apart, just inches away. The worst part, I still loved her. Even as I realized she had traded comfort for content. Even as I knew she'd rather edit my pain than ease it. Because love doesn't die in the moment you're hurt, it dies quietly, in the space where you're no longer seen, only studied. After that, I began to retreat, not suddenly, not obviously, but in small ways. Like how I stopped talking when I cried, or how I closed the bedroom door when the memories became too loud. She noticed, I think. She'd ask, "Are you okay?" But not in a way that invited truth, in a way that hinted, please be broken again, I'm running out of inspiration. One night, I left a note on her desk. It was short, just 5 words, underlined twice. Please write about someone else's pain. I didn't sign it, I didn't need to. She never mentioned it, but she stopped writing for a while after that. Or maybe she just started hiding the pages. She told me about the contest one evening when the sun was painting gold onto our apartment walls. She was barefoot, twirling a pencil between her fingers like it was a wand that granted her stories instead of wishes. It's themed around emotional authenticity, she said, eyes gleaming. They want something raw, something real. I smiled. I always did when she talked like that. Because when she believed in something, it was hard not to fall into orbit around her. And I wanted to help. So I offered. I stayed up with her for 3 nights. Proofreading, fixing commas, rearranging metaphors. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, and I sat beside her, sipping coffee I didn't want, pretending the ache in my chest was just fatigue. The more I read, the more I felt a strange itch in my bones, like déjà vu. Like walking through a dream I couldn't remember but knew by heart. Her protagonist was a quiet man, gentle, devoted, carried the weight of a dead brother. Couldn't breathe right on Tuesday nights. Had a habit of memorizing ceilings during panic attacks. I paused. I reread. And I asked, lightly, is this character based on me? She laughed, too quickly. No, just pieces of what I've seen. Isn't that what writing is? I nodded. Because how do you argue when someone turns your breakdowns into world building? But then came the climax. The scene where he collapses in a kitchen. Not metaphorically, literally. Folds like a dropped letter, sobbing on cold tiles while his lover stands nearby, scribbling notes. I remembered that night, every second of it, because I had been the letter. And then I saw it, the final line. He never knew he was just the ink. That sentence, it didn't pierce me, it gutted. I didn't say a word. Just closed her laptop gently, like it might break under the weight of what it held. She didn't notice. She was already reaching for her notebook again. I walked to the window. Rain had started falling, soft, hesitant, like it wasn't sure it was allowed. The streetlights below flickered like dying stars. Behind me, she asked, "What do you think of the ending?" I whispered, "It's perfect." Because it was. Brutally, poetically, perfect, and entirely mine. That night, when she fell asleep curled against her draft like a child hugging a diary, I stood in the doorway and watched her. He woman I loved, the woman who once kissed my trauma and told me it made me human, now signing her name under it. I didn't feel anger, or betrayal, just a hollow, echoing quiet, like the last page of a book you didn't know was ending. I didn't pack a bag, didn't grab my watch or my favorite hoodie, didn't take my charger, my books, or even my toothbrush. I just found a pen, the one she always left on the nightstand, and I wrote 5 words on a yellow sticky note. Since I'm only a story. Pause, breathe. The ink bled slightly, my hand trembled. Consider this my ending. I folded the note in half, placed it gently on her laptop, and walked out into the rain. No umbrella. No goodbye. The cold hit me like clarity. Each drop on my skin felt like punctuation. A final sentence, a closing bracket. I didn't look back at the apartment, didn't wait for her to wake up and run after me. Because she wouldn't. To her, I was already archived. A chapter she'd revised to perfection. Later, she'd tell people I disappeared, that I was too sensitive, or couldn't handle emotional truth. And maybe she's right, maybe I wasn't strong enough to be fictionalized. Or maybe she wasn't brave enough to love something that couldn't be edited. It's någon dagen din bisöndag. Weeks passed. Long, formless weeks where I became a ghost in my own life. I changed numbers, moved into a friend's spare room with peeling paint and a view of a brick wall. The silence was loud, but at least it wasn't scripted. I wanted to vanish, completely, let her win whatever award she was chasing, let the world believe she wrote something real, but some stories don't let you walk away. One morning, I opened my laptop to check a client email, just one, the only one, and a headline blinked at me from the homepage of a writing forum I used to frequent. The short story that's breaking the internet with its brutal honesty. The author's name was hers. The title? He never knew. He was just the ink. My stomach turned, my cursor hovered, but I clicked. It was like watching my life play out through tinted glass. Everything was there. The late-night collapse, the breathless anxiety, the guilt, the loss, my brother, the job interviews. Even the notebook on the nightstand. But the names were different. She gave me a new face, a new city. She even added fictional lines to make herself sound more nurturing. Like she had held me, wiped my tears, protected me. I laughed, dry, hollow, like my throat had forgotten how to produce anything warm. The comment section was a storm of praise. This made me cry. I've never read something so emotionally authentic. She must have lived this. You can't fake that kind of pain. I leaned back in my chair, eyes burning. Not because they were wrong, but because they were right. The pain was real, it just didn't belong to her. I closed the tab, opened it again, refreshed, scrolled. More shares, more praise. People were starting to quote it in other articles. Podcasters were analyzing the structure, calling it a new blueprint for emotional writing. They dissected the metaphors, paper-thin grief, and breaths that stuck like glass shards. They called them genius. But I remembered when I'd said those things, trembling on the floor, and she'd jotted them down like weather patterns. That night, I didn't sleep. I stood by the window as the city pulsed below, a quiet hum of lights and strangers. It started to rain again. Of course it did. Like my life refused to shed the metaphor. I opened a blank document, typed one line. Let me tell you the story she stole. And suddenly, my hands wouldn't stop. I wrote until dawn. Not to retaliate, not to humiliate, but to reclaim. I wrote the panic attacks as they really felt, not just as plot points but as suffocations with no warning. I wrote the loneliness of loving someone who holds your hand with one and holds a pen with the other. I wrote the moment I read her draft and realized I was just content. I wrote every part of me she filtered, flattened, polished, and I let it bleed. There was no exaggeration, no sweetened ending, just the truth, carved from ribs and nerve endings. By sunrise, I had 24 pages, no dialogue tags, no chapters, just memory, raw and bare. I titled it, The Stranger in Her Words, and I sent it, not to her, but to the same contest. No cover letter, no flair, just a story, with a pulse. That evening, the sun dipped low and slow, like it too, was ashamed of what had been done in its light. I poured myself coffee and stared out the window, my own name glowing in the submitted tab of the contest portal. There was no guarantee anyone would read it. Maybe it would get lost, maybe it would be discarded. But for once, I wasn't trying to be read. I just didn't want to be erased. It started with a shoebox. Buried deep in the back of my closet, under a sweatshirt I hadn't worn since before the lies. Inside it, old journals, scraps of poems written at 3 a.m. Therapy notes I never finished reading, Polaroids from quiet Sundays, text screenshots I once saved to remind myself she used to love me. I sat cross-legged on the cold wooden floor, the smell of dust and old perfume rising like a ghost, and for the first time, I didn't cry. I catalogued. Not to prove anything, not to wage war, but to remember what was mine before she made it hers. Each note I'd scribbled after a panic attack, each voice, each memo I whispered in the dark when my chest refused to expand, they became a thread, not of bitterness, but of clarity. She wrote her version in polished metaphors, I wrote mine in blood. There was no fictional name to hide behind, no pretty editing, just a man, cracked open, spine bent under the weight of being someone else's story. I moved to my desk, dim lamplight flickering over blank pages, and then I wrote. Not like a writer, not like a performer, but like a survivor. Each word was a wound I reopened, each paragraph, a breath I had choked down for too long. I described what it really felt like to cry alone while the person you loved jotted down your trembling for structure. How humiliating it is to hear your own breakdown described by someone else in third person, as if it were beautiful. I didn't invent a character, I didn't invent pain. I simply described the moment I realized her notebook had more of me in it than her arms ever did. How I became chapters before I even knew I was being written. I wrote about the silence, not the poetic kind, but the heavy, disorienting one, the silence that comes after you see your trauma quoted and applauded by strangers. How it steals the last breath of you, how it makes you doubt whether your suffering was real or just, well written. The night stretched thin, street lights blinked outside like tired eyes, the wind tapped at the windows like it too wanted to be let in. My hands cramped, fingers stiff, red, sore, but I kept going. Because there were screams inside me that had never been spoken, and they were finally finding their shape. There was a moment around 3:47 a.m. I paused, looked at the pages. Ink smudged, some lines crossed out, a few tear stains curling the edges. And I realized, this wasn't a draft. This was a reckoning. When the sky began to lighten, pale orange bleeding into the edges of the world, I saved the document. Title, the version she erased. No pen name, no clever tagline, just my real name. Mine. I opened the contest submission portal. Her name was still featured in the trending entries sidebar. A little flame emoji next to it, like a warning sign I hadn't noticed before. I uploaded my file, typed in my name, clicked submit. My hand hovered for a second, not out of fear, but finality. And then, I pressed enter. No fireworks, no drama, just silence, but not the kind that haunted me. This silence was mine, clean, still. And in it, I felt something loosen in my chest, not closure, not peace, but the beginning of something she could never write. The room smelled like expensive perfume and polished ambition. Velvet chairs, champagne glasses, laughter that echoed too perfectly, like it had been rehearsed. And overhead, fairy lights strung in careful arcs, as if someone had tried to catch stars just to impress the guests. She didn't see me when I arrived, of course not. I'd made sure of it, slipped in through the side entrance, head low, suit still wrinkled from last night's sleep. I didn't come to win, I came to witness. Because if she was going to stand beneath chandeliers and call my grief a masterpiece, I was going to watch her try to do it while I was breathing. She stood near the front, back arched in a familiar posture, that poised performer's stance she always used when she wanted the room to orbit her. She wore red. Of course she did, she always did when she wanted to be unforgettable. Lips painted, hair curled like it was sculpted strand by strand, eyes scanning the room, but never once falling on me. She held a wine glass like a trophy, laughed like she was already giving her acceptance speech in her head. And maybe she was. After all, her story had gone viral. The room buzzed with her name. People leaned in and whispered, "That's her, the one who wrote ink." They didn't know I was the ghost in the ink. The host took the stage, smile polished like the silver mic he gripped. People hushed. He spoke of pain, of honesty, of stories that bleed. Her head tilted proudly. I kept my eyes on her the whole time, even as my name sat sealed inside the envelope in his hands, burning like a heartbeat. He broke the seal. Time held its breath, then, he read it. Not hers, mine. There was a split second where no one reacted, like the room needed a moment to reorient. Then, polite applause, scattered at first, unsure. And in the center of it, her. She stood still, smile frozen mid-bloom. The glass in her hand didn't shatter, but something in her eyes did. She turned, slowly, and found me. For the first time in months, she saw me. Not as a muse, not as material, but as the man who reclaimed his narrative. She looked at me like I had rewritten the ending of her dream, but I didn't. I just corrected the credits. I walked up the aisle, past silk dresses and tailored suits. Past strangers who had cried over her version of my collapse. Each step felt like reclaiming a rib. I passed her. Our eyes locked. She didn't speak, didn't blink. I didn't stop. On stage, I didn't give a speech, didn't thank the Academy, didn't feign humility. I held the microphone. I didn't write this to win, I said. I wrote it to breathe. And then I walked off, leaving the award behind on the podium like an afterthought. As I exited, the applause returned, louder this time, but I didn't hear it. I only heard the silence in her chest. The one where my story used to echo. The ceremony was over. The applause had faded, echoing into expensive silence. The chairs stood half empty, wine glasses half full, and her? She was standing at the edge of the room like a painting about to peel off its frame. She approached me slowly, her heels tapping against the marble like soft warnings. She walked with the confidence of someone used to being the climax in every room, but tonight, she was the epilogue. Her voice was quiet, only dipped and trembling. "Congratulations," she said, lips curling into a smile too glossy to be sincere. And then, lower, barely above a whisper, "You stole my thunder." I looked at her, really looked, the curl of her lashes, the way her jaw tensed behind the smile, and I answered gently, almost like an apology. "No, you stole my scars." She didn't speak, didn't blink, just stood there as something flickered behind her eyes. Recognition? Guilt? Or was it just the unraveling of a lie that had gone on too long? Around us, the crowd began to shift. Not physically, emotionally. Eyes darted between us. The way whispers move when people smell a story. Someone nearby pulled up both stories, hers and mine, on their phone, screens lit like candles in a dark chapel, side-by-side comparison. Lines overlapped, scenes mirrored, phrases identical, only one of them raw, the other, dressed for applause. The conversations changed tone, from admiration to analysis, from, "She's brilliant" to, "Did she copy this?" from, "What a writer" to, "Was it even hers?" I watched it happen, watched the room bend without breaking, watched her body stiffen under the weight of being seen, truly seen. Because when you build your name on someone else's ache, you don't get to choose when it echoes. She tried to steady herself. "You gave them the messy version," she said, a little louder now. "Mine was crafted, refined." "Yes," I replied, meeting her gaze. "And edited until it was no longer human." She inhaled sharply, like the words punched deeper than she expected. But what hurt more than my voice was that she didn't control the narrative anymore. Nearby, someone whispered, "I thought she lived that." And another, "Wait, so his was real?" Her fingers curled into her dress, red silk crumpled like petals wilting too soon. Her smile, once her strongest armor, finally cracked. Not shattered, not exploded, just broke, quietly, like something inside her had been held too tightly for too long. For so long, she had painted herself as the girl who held the broken boy, the selfless muse, the grieving witness. But now, people were realizing. She hadn't written from love, she had written from possession, and I was no longer hers to perform. She leaned in one last time, close enough that her perfume touched the edge of my throat. Her voice broke as she asked, "Was any of it real to you?" And I didn't answer. Because there are questions not meant to be answered, only remembered. I turned, I walked past her, past the guests, past the screens and the lights and the applause that no longer echoed for her. Behind me, the room began to ripple, not with noise, but with truth. The kind of silence that clears the fog. And in it, she stood alone, smiling at no one. The email came at 2:14 a.m. I was awake. Not out of insomnia, but habit. Some nights, even silence echoes like footsteps through the past. I almost didn't open it. I thought it was another newsletter. Another literary digest selling hope and heartbreak in equal measure. But it wasn't. It was from a publisher. A real one. One I'd quietly admired from a distance, the way people stare at constellations without ever expecting to reach them. They had read my story, the unedited version, the one that didn't romanticize suffering, the one that bled without apology. They wanted the full manuscript, raw, brutal, honest. I stared at the screen for a long while, not smiling, not crying, just breathing. For the first time in years, my truth was no longer something to hide. I said yes, not to chase fame, not to spite her, but to reclaim what had been taken from me, word by word, breath by breath. I opened every journal, every voice memo, every painful timestamp etched into memory. And I rewrote my story. Not as fiction, but as a confession. It took months. Some days I couldn't write more than a paragraph. Others, I wrote entire chapters without blinking. I described everything. This morning I found her draft. The night I left without a sound. The way I once held her hand and thought it meant safety, not storage. I didn't make her a villain, I didn't have to. The truth already knew where to hurt. The book took shape like healing does, slow, uncertain, stitched at the seams. Some nights, I'd pause and wonder if publishing it would reopen wounds I had just begun to close. But then I'd remember, she published my pain before I even had the chance to name it. This wasn't revenge, this was a restoration, and when the manuscript was finished, when it sat in my inbox with a title that no longer made my chest tighten, I sent it, not with fear, not with pride, just stillness, and that was enough. It hit shelves 3 months later. A soft launch, no billboards, no press tour. But people found it, because the truth always finds its way into hands that need it. Reviews poured in, messages from strangers, people who had been used, reduced, romanticized by lovers who saw their pain as prose. Thank you for writing the version that wasn't cleaned up. I didn't know how much I needed this until I saw myself in it. And for the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt ready. She didn't reach out, not directly, but I heard things, that her publishing offer was rescinded quietly, that Forum had started flagging her submission, that she'd begun pivoting to fiction. She lost the contest, but more than that, she lost the illusion. Because the world may love a good story, but eventually, they can tell who's writing from truth, and who's borrowing someone else's pain. I didn't dance in her downfall, didn't gloat. Because I wasn't writing against her anymore. I was writing for myself. Sometimes, I visit bookstores. Not to check sales, but to see where the book lands on shelves. I saw it once between 2 titles that had nothing in common with mine, still, I smiled. Because my story, the messy one, the wounded one, the one that bled and stitched and didn't ask for permission, had a spine, a cover, a place, and that was more than she ever gave me. I still carry the pain, it doesn't disappear. It lives quietly in my chest, like a chapter I'll never fully close, but now, it's mine, framed in ink, bound with dignity, and no longer written by someone else's hand. It came on a Sunday. A soft morning, pale light bleeding through the blinds, the kind of quiet that feels like an exhale after a storm. I was sipping cold coffee rereading the final proof of the paperback edition, when the notification blinked, in the corner of my laptop. New message, her name. Still spelled perfectly, still familiar enough to hurt. I stared at it for a moment. Didn't open it right away, just let it sit there, like the scent of a memory I'd already aired out 100 times. But eventually, I clicked. There was no subject line, no greeting, just a single question, floating in white space like it didn't know how heavy it really was. Was any of it real to you? No apology, no denial, no confession. Just 6 words. 6 words that arrived too late to matter and too early to forget. I read them once, then again, and felt nothing. Not anger, not sorrow, not love. Just silence, the kind I had learned to make peace with. I didn't reply, not because I didn't have something to say, but because she wasn't owed the ending anymore. She'd written hers. I had rewritten mine. And this email, it wasn't a door, it was a mirror, and I didn't need to look into it to know what was behind it. Instead, I printed it out. Old school, black ink, single sheet, no formatting. Just her question, still trembling quietly in 12-point Times New Roman. I folded it once, then again, pressed it between the pages of the first edition of my book, right between chapter 3 and chapter 4. Right between the moment she stole my story and the moment I started writing it back. Let it rot with the rest of the fiction, let it fade between truths she'll never fully understand. Because this story, the real one, doesn't end with her. It ends with me choosing silence over spectacle. It ends with me letting go, not with a scream, but with a closing cover. I keep the book on my shelf, not at the front, not on display, tucked away, quiet, but present. Every now and then, I see it, and I remember that once, I was someone else's character, but now, I'm the author, And that email, that final, fragile question, it's the last page she'll never read. Because the truth, it lives where she can't touch it, where no edits can soften it, where no applause can claim it. The story is mine now. And that is the ending. She never saw it coming.